The morning sun painted golden streaks across the magnificent palace courtyard as Sergeant Marcus Thompson took his position for another day of duty. His red woolen uniform was pressed to perfection, each brass button gleaming like tiny mirrors. In the early light, the iconic black bearskin hat sat tall on his head, adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. For 15 years, Marcus had stood guard at this very spot, watching over the royal grounds with the dedication of a man who understood the weight of tradition. The palace courtyard stretched out before him like a grand theater stage, with its ancient stone walls telling stories of centuries past. Ornate iron gates marked the entrance where tourists would soon gather, their cameras ready to capture every detail of the famous Queen's guards. The cobblestones beneath his polished black boots had been worn smooth by countless footsteps of both guards and visitors throughout the decades. Marcus knew every inch of this place, from the intricate carvings on the palace walls to the way the morning shadows fell across the parade ground. As the clock tower chimed 8, the first wave of tourists began trickling through the gates. Marcus straightened his shoulders and fixed his gaze straight ahead, his face settling into the stoic expression that had become second nature over the years. The transformation was remarkable. Moments before, he had been a regular man adjusting his uniform and checking his watch, but now he became something else entirely. He was a living statue, a symbol of unwavering duty and centuries-old tradition. The rules of being a Queen's Guard were carved into his memory like commandments written in stone. Never break formation unless ordered to do so. Never speak while on duty except in cases of extreme emergency. Never react to anything tourists might say or do to get your attention. Never move except for the prescribed ceremonial movements every 10 minutes. These rules were not suggestions or guidelines. They were absolute laws that governed every moment of his time on duty. Marcus had learned these rules during his grueling training 15 years ago, when drill sergeants had tested every aspect of his physical and mental endurance. He remembered standing for hours in the rain, learning to ignore pain, hunger, and every distraction the world could throw at him. The training had been brutal but necessary, designed to create guards who could maintain their posts regardless of weather, crowds, or any other circumstances that might arise. The tourist crowd began to grow thicker as the morning progressed. Families with children pointing excitedly, elderly couples moving slowly with their cameras, young travelers with backpacks and guidebooks. They all came to see the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged their presence. Marcus had seen it all before, thousands of times. He knew the routine by heart. First would come the photographers snapping pictures from every possible angle. Then the brave ones would approach closer, trying to get the perfect selfie with the unmoving guard in the background. Some would make funny faces, hoping to catch even the slightest reaction. Others would ask questions, speaking loudly as if volume might somehow compel him to respond. Children would often stare and wonder, whispering to their parents about whether that guard was real or just a very realistic statue. Marcus had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain unmoved by it all. He had stood firm through thunderstorms that sent tourists running for cover. He had maintained his position while street performers played music and drew crowds just meters away. He had ignored marriage proposals from tourists who thought it would be funny to propose to a guard who couldn't say no. Nothing could break his concentration or make him forget his duty. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the stones and bringing more life to the courtyard. Tour guides began arriving with their groups, their voices carrying across the open space as they shared stories about the palace's history. Marcus could recite these stories himself. He had heard them so many times that he probably knew more palace history than some of the guides themselves. But he remained silent, letting the words wash over him like background music. A group of school children arrived with their teacher, their excited chatter filling the air with youthful energy. Marcus always found children the most challenging part of his duty. Their genuine curiosity and innocent questions sometimes tugged at something deep inside him. They would ask their teacher why the guard couldn't talk, whether his uniform was heavy if he got tired standing there all day. The teacher would explain about tradition and discipline, but Marcus could see in their young faces that they were trying to understand how someone could stand so still for so long. One little boy broke away from his group and approached Marcus directly. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with messy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile. The child stood directly in front of Marcus and looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, Marcus felt the urge to smile back, to acknowledge this innocent face looking at him with such wonder, but his training held firm. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his face expressionless. The boy's teacher quickly came to collect him, apologizing quietly to Marcus even though she knew he wouldn't respond. As they walked away, Marcus heard the boy ask, "Teacher, doesn't?" His face hurt from not smiling. The innocent question hit Marcus harder than any joke or silly face from an adult tourist ever could. Children saw things differently. They saw the human cost of his duty in ways that adults had long forgotten to notice. The crowd continued to ebb and flow around him like tides around a lighthouse. Marcus had learned to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. He knew which tourists were likely to cause problems, which ones were genuinely interested in the history, and which ones were just there for quick photos. He could sense the mood of the crowd, the way energy shifted when something interesting happened elsewhere in the courtyard. A street musician set up near the fountain, his guitar case open for donations. The man began playing gentle melodies that drifted across the courtyard, adding a soundtrack to the constant hum of conversation and footsteps. Marcus appreciated music, but he had trained himself not to let it affect his concentration. Still, on quiet moments between tourist waves, he found himself listening to the familiar tunes that had become part of his daily soundtrack. The palace bells chimed 10 o'clock, signaling time for Marcus to perform his ceremonial movement. This was one of the few times he was allowed to move during his shift, a precise series of steps that took him from one position to another, performed with military precision. The crowd always grew excited during these moments, cameras clicking rapidly. As the statue suddenly came to life, Marcus executed the movement perfectly, each step measured and deliberate. He turned 90 degrees to the right, took 4 precise steps forward, turned to face the palace, then returned to his attention position. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds, but it was a moment of almost choreographed beauty that never failed to impress observers. Then, just as suddenly as he had moved, he became still again. The morning was progressing normally, just like hundreds of others before it. Marcus settled back into his state of alert stillness, his mind cataloging the faces and movements around him while his body remained perfectly motionless. He had no way of knowing that this particular morning would be different from all the others. He had no idea that within the next few hours, everything he had been trained to do and believe about his duty would be challenged in ways he had never imagined possible. The courtyard had grown busier as the morning progressed into late morning. Dozens of tour groups moved through the space like colorful rivers, each guide holding up signs or flags to keep their members together. Marcus watched it all from his peripheral vision, his trained eyes automatically scanning for anything unusual while his body remained perfectly still. The constant flow of people had become as familiar to him as breathing, predictable. Patterns of movement that he could read like a book written in footsteps and voices. A large family from America had positioned themselves directly in front of Marcus for what seemed like their 100th photograph. The father was trying to organize everyone into the perfect pose while the mother fussed with the children's hair and clothing. Their teenage daughter looked embarrassed by the whole process, while their young son kept making faces at the camera. Marcus had seen this scene play out countless times with countless families, each thinking they were the first to discover the perfect photo opportunity with a motionless guard. The American father started speaking loudly to Marcus, as if volume might somehow compel a response. "Hey there, buddy, you must get tired standing there all day. How about a smile for the camera?" Marcus kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face showing no reaction whatsoever. The man tried a few more approaches, even going so far as to wave his hand in front of Marcus's face. When that failed to get any response, he finally gave up and rejoined his family for their photos, just beyond the American family. Marcus noticed a small commotion near the fountain. A group of elderly tourists had stopped to rest on the stone benches, and one woman seemed to be looking around frantically. She was speaking rapidly to her companions in what sounded like German, pointing in different directions and shaking her head. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but her body language clearly indicated distress. He filed this information away in his mind while continuing to maintain his position. The tour guides were in full swing now, their voices carrying across the courtyard as they shared stories about the palace's rich history. Marcus could hear bits and pieces of their presentations, tales of royal ceremonies, state visits, and the changing of the guard traditions that stretched back centuries. Some guides were more accurate than others, and Marcus had learned to distinguish between those who truly knew their history and those who embellished facts for dramatic effect. A group of Japanese tourists approached Marcus with their cameras, speaking quietly among themselves in their native language. They were more respectful than most visitors, maintaining a polite distance while taking their photographs. One elderly man in the group bowed slightly toward Marcus before they moved on. These small gestures of respect always touched Marcus, even though he couldn't show his appreciation. It reminded him that despite all the silly faces and loud jokes, many visitors truly understood the significance of what he represented. The morning sun was now directly overhead, casting shorter shadows across the cobblestones. Marcus could feel the warmth on his face and uniform, but his training had taught him to ignore physical discomfort. He had stood through scorching summer days and freezing winter mornings, never allowing weather to affect his performance. Today was pleasantly mild, making his duty easier than usual. Near the palace entrance, a wedding party had arrived for photographs. The bride's white dress billowed in the gentle breeze as the photographer positioned the group for formal shots. Marcus had witnessed hundreds of these photo sessions over the years, watching couples begin their married lives with the palace as their backdrop. There was something timeless about these moments that made him think of his own wife Sarah and their daughter Emma waiting for him at home. The crowd dynamics were shifting as lunchtime approached. Morning tour groups were being replaced by afternoon visitors, creating a brief lull in the constant flow of people. Marcus used these quieter moments to mentally review his training, running through emergency procedures and protocols that he hoped he would never need to use. Vigilance was not just about standing still. It was about being constantly aware and prepared for anything that might threaten the safety of the palace or its visitors. A street performer had set up near the main gate, drawing a small crowd with his juggling acts. The performer was skilled, keeping multiple balls in the air while maintaining a steady stream of jokes and commentary. Marcus could hear the audience laughing and applauding, but he kept his attention focused on his primary duty. Entertainment was for the tourists. His job was to remain alert and professional at all times. The lunch crowd was beginning to arrive, and Marcus could see food vendors setting up their carts along the nearby streets. The smell of hot dogs and roasted nuts drifted across the courtyard, reminding him that he had several more hours before his shift would end and he could enjoy his own meal. His stomach gave a small rumble, but he ignored it just as he ignored everything else that might distract him from his duty. A young couple approached Marcus with their small child, a toddler who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. The little boy was fascinated by Marcus's tall hat and bright red uniform, reaching out his tiny hands as if he wanted to touch the colorful fabric. His parents held him back gently while taking photos, but Marcus could see the pure wonder in the child's eyes. There was something magical about seeing the world through a child's perspective, where a guard in a fancy uniform was as amazing as any fairy tale character. The afternoon tour groups were arriving now, bringing fresh energy to the courtyard. Marcus noticed that afternoon visitors often had a different quality than morning tourists. They seemed more relaxed, having already visited other attractions and settled into their vacation rhythm. The morning visitors were often rushed, trying to fit too much into their schedules, while afternoon visitors took more time to really observe and appreciate what they were seeing. A group of art students had set up easels near the fountain, sketching the palace and its surroundings. Marcus found himself included in several of their drawings, rendered as a small but important figure in the larger composition. He wondered what they saw when they looked at him, whether they drew him as a person, or simply as another architectural element of the palace scene. Art had a way of capturing truth that photographs sometimes missed. The elderly German woman from earlier was back, this time with what appeared to be a security guard from the palace. She was still speaking rapidly and pointing in different directions, clearly upset about something. Marcus couldn't leave his post to help, but he made mental note of the situation in case it escalated into something that required his attention. Part of his job was to be aware of everything happening around him, even when he couldn't directly intervene. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself settling into the familiar rhythm of his duty. Hours of standing had taught him how to rest while remaining alert, how to observe without appearing to watch, how to be present without being intrusive. It was a skill that had taken years to develop, and he took quiet pride in his ability to maintain his post regardless of what was happening around him. The palace bells chimed 12:30, and Marcus prepared for his next ceremonial movement. The crowd began to gather in anticipation, cameras ready to capture the moment when the statue would come to life. But as he began to shift his weight in preparation for the movement, something caught his attention that would change everything. A small sound, barely audible above the crowd noise, reached his ears and made his blood run cold. The sound that caught Marcus's attention was faint but unmistakable, the frightened whimper of a small child. It cut through the noise of the crowd like a knife through cloth, reaching something deep in his trained consciousness that no amount of discipline could ignore. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but every other sense sharpened to locate the source of that heartbreaking sound. Years of fatherhood had fine-tuned his ability to distinguish between different types of children's cries, and this one carried the unmistakable note of genuine fear and confusion. Without moving his head even slightly, Marcus began scanning the crowd with his peripheral vision. The courtyard was packed with people now, the lunch crowd having merged with the afternoon tour groups to create a dense sea of bodies moving in all directions. Adults towered everywhere, their conversations creating a wall of sound that would easily drown out a small voice calling for help. Somewhere in that forest of legs and luggage was a child in distress, and Marcus felt his protective instincts beginning to stir despite 15 years of training to remain motionless. There it was again, a tiny voice barely rising above the crowd noise. "Mama, Mama, where are you?" The words were spoken in English, but with the careful pronunciation of a child still learning to form sentences properly. Marcus's heart clenched as he heard the growing panic in that small voice. His own daughter Emma was about the same age, and he could imagine how terrified she would be if she found herself lost in a crowd of strangers. Marcus shifted his eyes slightly to the left, using the technique he had learned for observing his surroundings without appearing to move. The crowd was thick near the fountain, where several tour groups had converged to take photographs. He could see adults everywhere, parents focused on their own children, tourists absorbed in their guidebooks and cameras, elderly visitors resting on benches. But nowhere could he immediately spot a lone child who might be the source of that frightened voice. The crying grew slightly louder, and Marcus was able to narrow down the location. The sound was coming from somewhere near the fountain, where the crowd was thickest. A large tour group from Italy was gathered there, their guide speaking animatedly about the palace architecture while pointing at various details. Behind them, a family with teenagers was taking selfies, and beyond that, a group of elderly tourists was studying their maps and planning their next destination. Then Marcus saw her. Tucked between two large suitcases near the fountain's edge was a little girl who couldn't have been older than 4. Her curly brown hair was slightly messy, as if she had been running or had slept badly. She wore a bright, yellow sundress decorated with tiny purple flowers, and in her small arms she clutched a well-worn stuffed rabbit that had clearly been her companion for many adventures. The rabbit was missing one ear and had patches of different colored fabric where it had been repaired with love and care. The child was turning in slow circles, her head tilted back as she tried to see over the crowd of adults surrounding her. Her face was streaked with tears, and Marcus could see her lower lip trembling as she fought to be brave. She would call out "Mama" every few seconds, her voice getting smaller and more desperate with each attempt. The crowd flowed around her, like water around a stone, most people completely unaware of her presence at their feet. Marcus watched in growing alarm as the little girl was jostled by passing tourists. A man with a large backpack bumped into her without realizing it, nearly knocking her over. She stumbled backward, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter, her eyes growing wider with fear. The crowd seemed to be getting thicker around her, and Marcus realized that with each passing moment, she was becoming more invisible to the adults who towered above her. The child looked directly at Marcus then, her tear-filled eyes meeting his for just a moment. Even from his position 20 feet away, he could see the hope that flickered across her face as she spotted his distinctive uniform. Children often saw the guards as protectors, as figures of safety and strength. But Marcus was bound by his duty to remain motionless, and he watched helplessly as that hope faded from her expression when he didn't respond to her silent plea for help. A group of teenagers pushed past the little girl, their attention focused on their phones as they tried to get the perfect angle for their photos. One of them stepped so close to her that she had to dodge to avoid being trampled. The near miss sent her stumbling toward the fountain, where she grabbed onto the stone edge to steady herself. Her stuffed rabbit fell to the ground, and she quickly scooped it up, holding it against her chest like a shield against the overwhelming world around her. Marcus felt his jaw clench despite his training. Every instinct he possessed as a father and as a human being was screaming at him to help this frightened child. He could see that she was becoming more panic-stricken with each passing moment, her small body shaking as the reality of being truly lost began to sink in. The crowd continued to grow around her, creating an ever-thickening barrier between her and any hope of finding her parents. The little girl began to cry harder now, her quiet whimpers escalating to more obvious sobs. A few tourists glanced down at her with mild concern, but in the busy atmosphere of the courtyard, most assumed she was simply having a tantrum and that her parents were nearby dealing with typical child behavior. No one seemed to realize that she was genuinely lost and afraid, separated from her family in a place that must have seemed enormous and terrifying to someone so small. Marcus could see the exact moment when fear transformed into panic in the child's eyes. She began moving more frantically, pushing through the crowd of legs that surrounded her like a forest of trees. Her voice grew louder as she called for her mother, but the increased noise of the crowd swallowed her cries. She was like a small boat being tossed in an ocean of indifferent humanity, and Marcus watched her getting swept further away from where she had been standing when he first spotted her. A tour guide walked past a little girl, speaking loudly into his microphone about the palace's history. His voice boomed across the courtyard, easily drowning out her small cries for help. She looked up at him hopefully, tugging gently on his jacket, but he was focused on his presentation and didn't notice her attempt to get his attention. The rejection sent fresh tears streaming down her cheeks, and she hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter. The internal battle raging in Marcus's mind was unlike anything he had experienced in 15 years of service. His training had prepared him for many situations: protesters, overly enthusiastic tourists, even potential security threats. But nothing had prepared him for watching a frightened child in need of help while being bound by duty to remain motionless. Every fiber of his being as a father wanted to break formation and scoop her up to provide the comfort and protection she so desperately needed. He thought of his own daughter Emma, safe at home with his wife. What would he want someone to do if Emma were lost and scared in a crowd of strangers? The answer was immediate and crystal clear. He would want someone to help her, regardless of rules or protocols or consequences. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him as he watched the little girl become smaller and more lost in the endless sea of tourists. The moment of decision arrived like a lightning bolt through Marcus's consciousness. He watched as the little girl stumbled again, this time falling to her knees on the hard cobblestones. Her stuffed rabbit flew from her grasp and landed several feet away, immediately in danger of being stepped on by the unaware crowd. The child scrambled toward her beloved toy on her hands and knees, tears streaming down her face as she desperately tried to reach it before someone crushed it underfoot. Marcus felt something snap inside his chest. 15 years of rigid military discipline crumbled in an instant as he watched this tiny human being crawl through a forest of legs, completely invisible to the adults around her. His daughter's face flashed in his mind, Emma's bright smile, her trusting eyes, the way she ran to him when she was scared or hurt. This little girl was someone's Emma, someone's precious child who needed help right now. The rules that had governed his every movement for over a decade suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the sight of a frightened 4-year-old fighting to save her stuffed companion from being trampled. Marcus took his first unauthorized breath in hours, filling his lungs with air that tasted of freedom and purpose. His hands, which had remained perfectly still at his sides, began to tremble slightly as adrenaline flooded his system. The crowd around the little girl continued to move like an oblivious river. A woman in high heels stepped within inches of the fallen rabbit, completely unaware of the drama unfolding at her feet. The child lunged forward, managing to grab her toy just as another tourist's foot came down where it had been lying. She pulled the rabbit against her chest and looked around desperately, her small face a mask of terror and confusion. Marcus made his choice. For the first time in 15 years of flawless service, he abandoned his post. The movement started small, just a slight shift of his weight from one foot to the other. But that tiny motion broke a dam that had been holding back his humanity for too long. His left foot moved forward, then his right, and suddenly Marcus Thompson was walking away from his position with deliberate, purposeful steps. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to stare at the impossible sight of a Queen's Guard in motion. Cameras and phones appeared as if by magic, everyone wanting to capture this unprecedented moment. Whispers rippled through the courtyard like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Is he allowed to do that? Something must be wrong. Are we in danger? Marcus felt every eye in the courtyard focused on him as he walked toward the little girl. His red uniform, designed to command attention and respect, now made him feel like a beacon drawing the entire world's gaze. But he pushed aside his discomfort and focused only on the small figure crouched near the fountain, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline in a storm of confusion. The tourists parted before him as he approached, creating a pathway through the crowd. Some stepped back in respect, others in uncertainty about what was happening. Parents pulled their own children closer, unsure whether this departure from normal protocol meant danger or something else entirely. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted from casual sightseeing to something charged with tension and anticipation. When Marcus was still 10 feet away, the little girl looked up and saw him approaching. Her tear-streaked face showed confusion. At first, why was the tall man in the red coat walking toward her when he had been standing so still before? But as he drew closer, something in his expression must have reassured her because she stopped crying and simply stared at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Marcus knelt down on the cobblestones when he reached her, bringing himself to her level. The action sent another wave of gasps and camera clicks through the crowd. A Queen's Guard kneeling was almost as unprecedented as one walking away from his post. His knees pressed against the cold stone, and he could feel the weight of his ceremonial sword at his side. But all of that faded into background noise as he focused on the frightened child before him. "Hello there, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice gentle and warm after hours of enforced silence. The words felt strange in his throat, unused to speaking during duty hours. "What's your name?" His tone was exactly the same one he used with his own daughter, patient, kind, and completely non-threatening. The little girl blinked at him, surprised to hear him speak after seeing him stand so silently. "I'm Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter and looked at Marcus with a mixture of wonder and residual fear. "I can't find my mama." The simple statement broke Marcus's heart all over again. Here was a child doing her best to be brave, while facing what must have felt like an impossible situation. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face completely. Gone was the stern, impassive mask of the dutiful guard, replaced by the warm, caring expression of a father. "It's very nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Marcus, and I'm going to help you find your mama, okay?" He kept his voice calm and reassuring, even though he was acutely aware of the hundreds of people watching their every interaction. The crowd around them had formed a complete circle now, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The initial shock and uncertainty had given way to something softer, more emotional. People were beginning to understand what they were witnessing, not a security breach or protocol violation, but an act of pure human kindness. Many in the crowd were parents themselves, and they could easily imagine their own children in Sarah's. The situation. Sarah nodded at Marcus's promise to help, and some of the tension left her small shoulders. "She has yellow hair like mine," she offered, trying to be helpful. "And she was wearing a blue dress with white flowers. She smells like the perfume that smells like roses." The child's innocent description brought small smiles to the faces of nearby tourists, and several people began looking around as if they might spot Sarah's mother in the crowd. Marcus gently extended his hand toward Sarah. "Would it be okay if I hold your hand while we look for your mama? That way we won't lose each other and all these people." Sarah looked at his large, gloved hand for a moment, then slowly placed her tiny fingers in his palm. The trust she showed in that simple gesture moved several onlookers to tears. Standing up carefully while keeping hold of Sarah's hand, Marcus began to scan the crowd with professional efficiency. His height and distinctive uniform made him visible from far across the courtyard, which he hoped would help if Sarah's parents were searching for her. The crowd respectfully made space around them, creating a protective barrier while still maintaining their circle of observers. Marcus could hear phones buzzing as people began sharing videos and photos of what they were witnessing. He knew that this moment was being broadcast to the world in real time, that his career might be over before the day was done. But as he looked down at Sarah's trusting face and felt her small hand in his, he realized he didn't care about any of that. Some things were more important than rules and regulations and perfect service records. The search for Sarah's mother was about to begin, and Marcus was determined to reunite this brave little girl with her family, no matter what consequences he might face for his decision to choose compassion over protocol. With Sarah's small hand securely in his, Marcus began moving through the crowd with the same purposeful stride that had carried him through 15 years of military service. But now, instead of marching in formation or standing at attention, he was on a mission that felt more important than any ceremonial duty he had ever performed. The crowd parted before them like the sea, creating a pathway while maintaining their protective circle around the unlikely pair. Sarah walked beside him with quick little steps, trying to match his longer stride. She had stopped crying completely, now, her tears drying on her cheeks as hope replaced despair. Every few seconds she would look up at Marcus's face, as if reassuring herself that this tall protector was really there and really helping her. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked safely under her free arm, no longer in danger of being lost in the crowd. The tourists who had gathered to watch were now actively helping in the search. Parents lifted their own children onto their shoulders to get a better view over the crowd. "What does your mama look like again, sweetheart?" called out a kind woman with a British accent. Sarah repeated her description in her small voice, and immediately dozens of people began scanning the courtyard for a woman with yellow hair, wearing a blue dress with white flowers. Marcus used his military training to conduct a systematic search. He started from where he had first spotted Sarah and began moving in a grid pattern, covering every section of the courtyard methodically. His height advantage allowed him to see over most of the crowd, and his distinctive uniform made him a beacon that could be spotted from anywhere in the area. If Sarah's mother was looking for her daughter, she would certainly notice the unusual sight of a Queen's Guard walking hand in hand with a small child. The atmosphere in the courtyard had completely transformed. What had started as a typical tourist day filled with sightseeing and photo opportunities had become something much more meaningful. Strangers were working together, united in their desire to help reunite a lost child with her family. Tour guides paused their presentations to join the search. Street performers stopped their acts to scan the crowd. Even the normally busy food vendors stepped away from their carts to help look. A young man with a camera approached Marcus respectfully. "Sir, I was filming when this started. Would you like me to post this online? Maybe her family will see it and know where to find you." Marcus nodded gratefully, realizing that social media might be their best tool for reaching Sarah's parents quickly. Within minutes, the video was spreading across multiple platforms with captions asking people to share and help find Sarah's family. Sarah seemed amazed by all the attention and help surrounding her. She had gone from being invisible in the crowd to being the center of a massive community effort. "All these people want to help me find my mama?" she asked Marcus in wonder. "Yes, sweetheart," Marcus replied. "Sometimes when someone needs help, everyone comes together to make things better." His words carried to the nearby crowd, and many people smiled at the simple truth he had shared. They had been searching for about 10 minutes when Marcus heard a commotion near the palace entrance. A woman's voice was rising above the general noise of the crowd, calling out frantically, "Sarah, Sarah, where are you? Has anyone seen a little girl in a yellow dress?" The voice was getting closer. Moving through the crowd with desperate urgency, Marcus stopped walking and lifted Sarah up so she could see over the heads of the surrounding tourists. "Do you hear that voice, sweetheart? Does that sound like your mama?" Sarah's face lit up like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Mama, mama, I'm here," she called out, her small voice carrying surprisingly far in the hushed atmosphere of the courtyard. The crowd began parting even wider, creating a clear pathway between Marcus and Sarah and the source of the woman's voice. Within seconds, a blonde woman in a blue flowered dress came running through the opening, her face streaked with tears of relief and panic. She was followed closely by a man who was presumably Sarah's father, both of them looking like they had been searching frantically for some time. The reunion was instant and emotional. Sarah practically leaped from Marcus's arms into her mother's embrace, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. "Oh, my baby, my sweet baby," the mother sobbed, holding Sarah so tightly it seemed she might never let her go again. "I turned around for 1 second to read the map, and you were gone. I've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah's father reached them a moment later, wrapping both his wife and daughter in his arms. "Thank God," he kept repeating. "Thank God you're safe." The family's relief was palpable, and many onlookers found themselves wiping away tears as they witnessed the powerful emotion of the reunion. After several minutes of holding her daughter, Sarah's mother looked up at Marcus with eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved her. You broke all your rules to help my little girl." Marcus knelt down again to be at Sarah's level as she remained in her mother's arms. "Any parent would have done the same thing," Marcus said simply. "I have a daughter about Sarah's age at home. I know how scary this must have been for all of you." Sarah reached out from her mother's embrace and touched Marcus's face gently with her small hand. "Thank you, Marcus," she said solemnly. "You're a very good soldier." The crowd that had gathered to witness the search and reunion began to applaud spontaneously. It started with just a few people clapping, but quickly spread until the entire courtyard was filled with a sound of appreciation and approval. Many people were openly crying, moved by the display of human kindness they had just witnessed. Phones continued to record, capturing every moment of this extraordinary story. Sarah's father shook Marcus's hand firmly. "Sir, I know you probably got in trouble for leaving your post. If there's anything we can do, if you need someone to speak to your superiors about why you did this, please don't hesitate to ask." Marcus appreciated the offer, but he was already thinking about the conversation he would soon have with his commanding officer about his actions. As the family prepared to leave, Sarah insisted on hugging Marcus one more time. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked hopefully. "I want to show you my drawings when I get home." Marcus smiled and promised that if he was still assigned to this post, he would look for her. The family walked away together, Sarah skipping between her parents while clutching her rescued stuffed rabbit. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but many people approached Marcus to thank him personally for what he had done. "You restored my faith in humanity today," said an elderly gentleman. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," added a young mother with her own children in tow. Marcus listened to each comment with humble gratitude, still processing what had just happened. As the courtyard returned to something resembling normal tourist activity, Marcus realized he needed to return to his post and face whatever consequences awaited him. He had broken the most fundamental rules of his position, abandoned his duty in front of hundreds of witnesses, and caused an international incident that was already spreading across social media around the world. But as he walked back toward his assigned position, Marcus felt a peace he had never experienced in 15 years of perfect service. Sometimes being a true protector meant knowing when the spirit of duty was more important than the letter of the law. He had chosen to be human first and a soldier second, and he would face whatever came next with no regrets about his decision to help one frightened little girl find her way back to safety.